Hello, I'm Jan Scholes from the Real Asset Company, and today I'm joined by Douglas Carswell MP for Clacton as Conservative. Thank you for joining us today. Today I'd like to talk to you about your Currency and Banknotes Amendment Bill, which you presented to Parliament in September last year. Could you maybe just give us a brief explanation of that and how it came about?
Well, the bill was really just a way of floating an idea, but I think the idea is really quite a serious idea. Like many people, I grew up assuming that money was just the way it was. It was something that government produced and we all used, and government controlled the supply of money, and that was that. But as this financial crisis has gone on, I've begun to realise that actually things aren't quite what they appear. First of all, governments have only really been controlling the amount of money in circulation since 1971, the year I was born, and in my lifetime they've controlled the money supply not in the interests of productive activity and productive Western economic activity, but in the interests of themselves. And so they've run a monetary policy that's basically transferred wealth from all of us to them. And I think that they have created a money system that's unsustainable. Now, I, like many people, assumed I was a monetarist. It's simply because what sort of centre-right non-socialists used to presume. But the more you think about it, the more I think that monetarism is basically slow-motion Keynesianism. It's, monetarism presumes that government can control the supply of money. I don't think government's any more capable of controlling the supply of money than they are controlling telephone lines or airlines or the weather. And so the more I think about it, the more I think that actually monetarism is like many other isms, a great theory, but it just never seems to happen. We seem to have a sort of debauched monetarism practiced by people like Alan Greenspan and Mervyn King, which means that we try to use so-called monetarism as a sort of fiscal stimulus for the economy. We have the amount of money put in circulation in the interests of big government and big corporatist banking interests, and it's not good for me, it's not good for my constituents. So I've become very interested in the idea of currency competition. Now, I think this is what's so transformative. The internet. The internet allows me to shop around for music and to, I can go on Spotify or iTunes. It gives me instantaneous choice. It gives me instantaneous choice not just when I'm looking for music, but when I'm looking for information. It's only a matter of time before the internet allows me that sort of touch button instantaneous choice over what currency I use. A few days ago I've got a 2-year-old daughter and she loves Peppa Pig, and I downloaded some Peppa Pig for her to watch on my iPlayer. I can't remember whether I paid in dollars or pounds, because it depends on which Amazon website I went to. There's a London Underground station a few feet away from here where people from all over the world pay for their tickets in yen and euros and US dollars electronically without being aware of the use of different currencies. It's done electronically and seamlessly. This technology, whether on the internet or digital payments, is soon going to mean that all of us can basically shop around in any currency. And the idea of a monopolistic state-run currency within any one jurisdiction, I think, will become anathema. And my bill is really about encouraging this, encouraging currency competition. I was fiercely against the euro because I'm against a monopoly currency for the whole of Europe, but I'm against the idea of any kind of monopoly currency because I think it's bad. It's bad for the people, it's good for government and good for big corporatist interests. So for technological reasons, for economic reasons, for a whole range of reasons, I think we need to return to honest money. And the only way we can return to honest money is if people can shop around for the currencies that they use. And
so if central banks now put on the step of, okay, we've got to keep our currencies good and honest, do you think that they're less likely then to debase their currencies as they're seeing currently because they're in proper competition with other currencies and for the use?
Absolutely. I mean, you said, wait for central banks to manage their currencies honestly and competently. Find me an example of a country that's managed to do that, bar Switzerland, or possibly Norway, in the past 50 years. All central banks are basically branches of the state, and therefore they run the currency in the interests of the state. In this country, we had a great song and dance about 15 years ago as to the precise status of the Bank of England and whether the NPC should be subject to this sort of oversight or that sort of oversight. At the end of the day, it's all blah blah. The only real check against the looters and the moochers defrauding our currency is the ability of the citizens to opt out of that currency. The internet allows us to do that in practical terms. We don't have to carry stacks of multiple currencies. I think it's vital that happens. It's a bit like this. In the old days, exam boards used to be in competition with one another, and the reason why a particular exam board did not debauch the value of the exam was because if they did, they would be seen as worthless and lose market share to exam boards that had retained their exams as highly competitive. We need a similar system of competition to prevent central banks from debauching the value of the currency.
This idea has also been seen before as a Conservative idea. I think back in 1989 it was presented as a Treasury paper. Is this different in any way? Is it similar ideas?
Well, I very rarely praise John Major, and I struggle to find something where I think he was right on a big issue of the day. But weirdly, on this issue, at the time when the euro was being proposed as a sort of giant monopoly currency for the whole of Europe, from the Treasury came this paper when John Major was around, suggesting...
He was Chancellor at the time, was it?
I believe so.
Yeah.
Suggesting the idea of competing currencies. Now, I think there are two great tragedies that explain why this never took off. Number one, I think it was advocated by people who didn't really believe in it. They put it forward as an idea, as a spoiler tactic against the idea of the euro. Number two, it was sort of pre the digital revolution, or the digital revolution was really only getting going, and we just simply didn't understand that it would allow currency competition to become an everyday reality for everyone. But I think it's time to reinvestigate that proposal. Personally, I think the only way that Europe can get out of its monetary mess is by allowing the jurisdictions that have been ruined by Euro membership currency competition. If I was Chancellor of the Exchequer in Britain, I would be negotiating with Ireland and saying, yeah, we will support the launch of a new Irish currency in return for mutual recognition of one another's currencies as legal tender, thereby allowing currency competition between our different countries. I think if we applied the same logic, perhaps with the IMF backing it, to Greece, to Portugal, to Spain, to Italy, we could gradually allow a breakup of the Eurozone, but that's not to replace one badly managed monetary regime with another. I think what we need is to move away from the idea of state monopolistic currencies and have it's no coincidence that places like Hong Kong that are pretty prosperous, you can, to all intents and purposes, do business in the local currency, the US dollar, and a whole stack of other currencies. If we could start doing that in Europe, then I think we could see a return to prosperity in the Eurozone.
And again, this idea has also been seen in 1976 with an economist, Friedrich Hayek. And he at the time said it didn't just have to be, in his proposal, not just central banks issued currency, but also private enterprise. Yeah. Would you support a similar idea, or do you just see it as national currency?
There's a really weird thing happened. I didn't read that bit of Hayek, but I now know what he means. And there's a part of the world that's already actually doing this really weirdly. And so much for Western conceit. It's actually in Africa where this is starting. There are countries in Africa where people use mobile telephones as a form of payment, and this is very well established, and people know about this. One thing people don't quite understand is that in countries in East Africa where there's very high rates of inflation, people are beginning to use the mobile phone credits as a store of wealth. You're almost getting a private currency growing up in parts of Africa through the mobile telephone system of micropayments. If you had a period of high inflation in this country, I could well envisage de facto private currencies emerging. If I knew, for example, that I had to spend a certain amount of money every year on groceries, and I could pay the supermarket online in pounds, and they would retain the amount of money that they owed me in perhaps a form of, Tesco credits or Asda credits, I think you could very well begin to see the emergence of private currencies, private payments. And I think there's also a more broader, profound issue. We've gotten used to the idea of payments being made by banks. Perhaps that's a mid-20th century way of making payments. Perhaps we're moving towards a world in which payments can be made without that expensive banking architecture, without people making the payments having to subsidise and sustain a huge banking architecture. Perhaps a company like O2 could facilitate payments.
Because they have the same technology.
Payments, electronic payments without banking. And once that begins to happen, who says that the pound sterling, the George Osborne pound, or the Barack Obama dollar has to be the medium of exchange? You could have the O2 credit unit. You could have de facto the emergence of a whole series of payment methods that becomes private currency. It doesn't sound so far-fetched anymore. Quit thinking about the money system as being one based on banking. I think the digital revolution means we're going to very soon move to a system of payments where the whole architecture of banking becomes irrelevant to the making of payments. Companies like O2 and Tesco's will be able to make payments. And once that happens, and once you've got choice over what currencies you use, who says it's got to be the state-owned sterling?
And of course, where we would come into that, the real asset companies, we're supporters of gold and silver as money.
Yeah.
And we very much see a role that this could be used, but it has to be accepted as legal tender first of all, which I suppose is a similar issue with Asda and Tesco credits. Ultimately, you still have to get cash out of it if you want.
Well, my understanding is that the definition of legal tender is not, if something is legal tender, it doesn't mean you can go into a shop and insist upon somebody accepting it for payment. There's no law in this country that insists that a shopkeeper must accept any note as payment. It's entirely up at their discretion as to whether they take this £50 note or that £5 note. My understanding is that legal tender means what the government will accept in payment if you owe money to the government. And I think actually if the government would start, if when you owe the money to the taxman at the end of every month, if you could begin to pay the government in a whole range of different currencies, and the government, there was a basket of currencies that the government was forced to accept in payment of debts you owed to the government, then I think it would begin to make it more difficult for the government to basically defraud the rest of us by debauching the currency.
And just looking at your bill again, how has it been received by your contemporaries? I think one Labour MP stood up when you first presented the bill and said that you were sort of trying to get rid of the sterling and we must defend the sterling.
Yeah, I spent all my adult life campaigning to keep the pound in this country and not join the euro. Now I want to bring about changes that will ensure that the pound retains its value. The one way of guaranteeing that the pound loses its value, and the pound's lost something like half its value in 20 years, is the fact that it's run by a little clique of people in Whitehall in the interests of big corporate bankers. That is why the pound has lost its value. If we had currency competition, the people who preside over the pound would have to be incredibly careful to make sure it didn't lose value. So I want there to be, I want us to keep the pound, but I don't want us to be at the mercy of the clowns running the MPC at the Bank of England. And so let's keep the pound as our national currency, but let's also allow people to shop around. English is our national language, but no one prevents me from buying any book I want in any language I like on Amazon.
And so where is the bill now? It's had its first reading and it was due for a second reading 20th of January.
The bill's dead.
Right.
I mean, and the bill was never going to get anywhere.
But it's surely promoted debates.
Yeah, you know what I mean by memes. We need to get the memes out there. We need to get these ideas, these self-replicating ideas, to get out there into the ether. Politicians very rarely do the right thing because they see the light, but because they feel the heat. And politicians are going to feel the heat in a way they don't quite realise as as the fiscal crisis continues to unfold. I personally think since 1971 we've had a system of fiat currency that's unsustainable. We're beginning to move into a world in which I think many assumptions about the nature of fiat money are going to start to unravel. Politicians will have to grasp around for new ideas. The purpose of me introducing that bill is so that, in desperation, I hope they will one day grab hold of that idea to get them out of the hole into which they've sunk. We want to get the idea of currency competition out there, and I don't expect them to see the light right away and to adopt it. But when all else fails, and when it's 4 o'clock in the morning and all the other bogus solutions have failed them, I hope that they might actually suddenly realise there is one way out of this. It's currency competition. You could start it in Ireland tomorrow. It would guarantee Irish sovereignty. It would guarantee Ireland's return to prosperity. And if Ireland can have competing currencies and then Britain can have competing currencies, maybe the whole of the West could have competing currencies.
I find it quite interesting that you keep relating back to 1971 because that was when we lost our attachment to gold altogether.
Yeah.
Fiat currency is primarily backed by confidence. So your definition of return to honest money is something that is backed by the most confidence.
Well, yeah, I think 71 is the key date. I mean, the sort of leftist dogma that we're all taught in schools and as undergraduates is that we left the gold standard in the 30s. Yes, we did, but the real story and the really significant story is not when we left the gold standard in the 30s. It's the point at which the only thing restraining the amount of money in circulation was the self-restraint of the government. And government is not very good at restraining government. You know, so 71 really, until 1971, the dollar was somehow attached to gold and we were somehow attached to the dollar. There was an anchor, there was a restraint. It wasn't a perfect restraint, but there was a measure of restraint. Since 71, about the only country in the world that's had a measure of restraint is Switzerland. And again, it's an imperfect restraint. But you know, I personally do not advocate us adopting the gold standard. I think what was good about the system before 71 was that there was a restraint. A better way of attaching a restraint to the actions of government is competition. Rather than saying we've got to attach our paper currency to the value of a commodity, gold or silver, I think a much better thing to do is to restrain government and restrain the ability of central banks to defraud our currency and debauch money by allowing people to opt out of their voucher notes.
I think we've got plenty, our readers have plenty to say about that. But thank you very much for your time today.
Not at all. Thank you very much.